I'm going to share with you 4 essential technologies that you need to know in order to fast track your tech career. This will help you narrow your search and zoom in on skills that are in high demand. So let's start from the beginning. You must know Git. Not get, but Git. G-I-T. So what's Git and why do you need to know it? There's a ton of information and tutorials on the web, but I'm going to break it down into simple, practical terms. These days, almost everything in technology revolves around some sort of code. That code gets stored into publicly available code repositories. Git is what allows you to interact with that code. And I know what you're thinking, I'm just trying to figure this stuff out. What's he talking about? I get it. So let me explain it like this. Imagine having all of the answers for your next test. Or better yet, remember open book tests? You know that all of the answers were inside the book. Now replace that book with code repositories. Let's say you want to know how to code this or code that. Using Git will allow you to interact with code written by other people. It's like your own Wikipedia for code. And remember, Git allows you to connect with code repositories. The largest code repository in the world is called Github. So go to www.github.com and create an account. This will unlock a world of information for you. GitHub houses code from every major tech company, Facebook, Google, Microsoft, and the list goes on and on. Go see for yourself. Go to GitHub and search for Google. That will pull up Google's code repositories. Go try it with Amazon Web Services. You'll see all of the code that they've published. Do you realize how powerful this is? All of these tech powerhouses create this code and upload it to these repos for the whole world to see. This is what's known as open source. This code or source code is open for everyone to use. And I know some of you may just be starting out in tech, so asking you to go look at Microsoft's code repo may be a bit of a stretch. But I wanted to show you the power of open source and what's available via open source. And for you guys that are just starting out, let me give you something that'll apply to you. Go to GitHub and search for Free Code Camp. They have information for several technologies, HTML, JavaScript, APIs. Essentially, they lay out the roadmap to become a full stack developer. They have instructions on how everything works and the actual code used to make it work. Furthermore, they have their own website and YouTube channel to help you learn, all for free. So I'll leave links for those in the description below. Let's say maybe you want to learn Python. Go to GitHub and search for Python. The difference between learning here versus Google or YouTube is that you can see the actual code. You can download the actual code. Reading through actual code is a game changer. And this doesn't have to be specific to developers. Let's say you're more of an application person, or maybe you want to do scripting more than programming. Well, you guessed it, you can search for scripting languages too. Bash, PowerShell, whatever, and it will have the actual code. Same for more advanced technologies like Kubernetes, Docker, Terraform, or whatever. GitHub is a treasure trove of excellent information. And now that you know this, what will you do with that information? That leads us to the next tech to learn, VSCode. VSCode is the developer's tool of choice these days. It was developed by Microsoft and can basically run anywhere. Windows, Mac, Linux, it doesn't matter. Although I said it was the developer's tool of choice, it isn't only for developers. You can think of VS Code as an editor, plain and simple. If you want to edit text, fine, you can do that. If you want to code in a specific language, well, you can do that too. The best part is that it's open source, which means it's free. It also means that you can take a look at the actual source code in GitHub. So let's take a look at the VS Code repo. It'll have their upcoming plans, their roadmap, upcoming bug fixes and releases. Suddenly, it's like you're an insider. It's like you're part of the Microsoft VS Code community without ever stepping foot into Microsoft. In fact, this is exactly what the open source community is. So what's next? Linux. It used to be a Microsoft world, but not anymore. Microsoft is still a major player, but Linux has also cemented its place. You know Windows as being the operating system for Microsoft. Mac OS is the operating system for Apple. Linux is just another operating system. You know the battle, PC versus Mac. The truth is, Mac gained in popularity, and its rise contributed to the rise of Linux. Although Mac OS and Linux are not the same, they're more similar than Windows, for example. So it wasn't much of a stretch to dabble in Linux if you were already a Mac user. It's only been within the last 5 to 8 years or so that Windows made an effort to become more compatible with Linux. Okay, so why should you learn Linux? Linux is what runs most of today's web servers. So most of these websites, web applications, mobile apps, and so forth are built on top of Linux. Plus, Linux is open source and free to use. There's some caveats like Red Hat, but I'll save that for another video. But with the world moving to the web, people forget that the web runs on top of Linux. But many people find Linux to be cumbersome at first. For the most part, it's all command line driven, which means no point and click. You have to type in commands, but you get used to it. After a while, you actually prefer it. It's so much faster keeping your hands on the keyboard instead of reaching for the mouse. But the other benefits to learning Linux is that many of the newer advanced technologies like Docker and Kubernetes use commands that are very similar to Linux. That makes ramping up on those newer technologies so much faster and easier. Here's a fun fact. Linux was created by Linus Torvalds, who also created Git. Let me know in the comments if you knew that, or if you know who owns GitHub now. We'd love to get some interaction. But on to tech number 4. If I were starting today, I would learn Terraform. Now before I get into Terraform and tell you what it's all about and what it does, let me recap and provide a roadmap for you. This will put things into perspective and you'll understand why Terraform matters. So we started with Git. Understanding Git will naturally send you into GitHub, the most prominent code repo in the world. This gives you access to information that you can't get anywhere else. This passes you into the open source community where the best minds in technology openly provide their input. Now that you have access, you can use Git to pull that code down into VSCode. This is where the magic happens. This is where you develop your applications. This is where you get your actual hands-on experience. So let's say you're going to go build a web application. Where do you put it? On a Linux server. So it makes sense to know Linux. This will help you troubleshoot and debug your applications since you'll be able to figure out if it's a code or a server issue that's causing your problems. Furthermore, knowing Linux makes you comfortable with the command line, which can then be used as a foundation for more advanced items like Kubernetes, Docker, and cloud computing. Oh, there it is, cloud computing. So what does cloud computing have to do with this? Let me explain. So you built this application that runs on a Linux web server. But where is this Linux web server? Is it in your house? Probably not. It'd make more sense to stand up the server in AWS, Microsoft Azure, or GCP, also known as cloud providers. This is where the Terraform comes in. Terraform allows you to build up this type of infrastructure using code. So think about it this way. If you needed to stand up a web server in AWS, you'd need to log in and launch a server. Then you'd need to log into that server to configure it. It's not that difficult. But let's say you wanted to do the same thing 6 months later. Would you remember everything that you did? Maybe yes, maybe no. Wouldn't it be easier to have a step-by-step instruction that will do this for you? This is essentially what Terraform does. This is what we call infrastructure as code. So if we talk about that previous example, you could write Terraform code to stand up and configure that web server. Then if you needed to do the same thing 6 months later, you could just rerun the code. And as an added bonus, let's say you no longer needed the environment. You could do a Terraform destroy to remove those web servers. What if you wanted to make some changes? You could update the Terraform code and run a Terraform apply. This makes administering environments so much faster and easier. And for those engineers out there, how many times have you heard, what changed in the environment? This stuff was working until yesterday. I can tell you, engineers hate to hear this because the simple fact is, if someone logged onto a server and started changing things, it's really hard to tell what they did. If you set this up in Terraform, you can just reapply the code and things go back to the way they were. It's that simple. And in this last example, we talked about setting a server up in AWS. What if you wanted to do it in Azure? Okay, no problem. Just update the provider code in Terraform, swap out some parameters, and voila. Now you're ready to set things up in Azure. This is very powerful. Now instead of specifically learning each different cloud provider, you can learn Terraform to create resources in any cloud provider. This Terraform piece is probably the most advanced thing to learn in this series of technologies. But once you get through the first 3 technologies, you'll find yourself asking, how can I do this in code? How can I make this stuff easier? How can I make this stuff repeatable? These tools and technologies will give you an edge and put you on the fast track to success. Look, I've been in technology for over 20 years, and that experience gave me a wealth of knowledge. I know what it takes to get to the top. So if you have questions, drop them in the comments. We'll get you real-world answers. Let's get some interaction. Click like, subscribe, and share this with your friends because we're on a mission to build an insider's tech community. Subscribe to become a part of the movement. Now that you know the secrets, watch this video to see what I believe to be the hottest job in technology.